Chapter 11 of the Dark House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark House by George Manville Fenn. Chapter 11. The Treasure. A week of horror and anxiety, during which the customary legal processes had been gone through. A jury had visited the dark house and been conducted through the two rooms, to go away disappointed at not seeing the inside of the great iron safe. Then, after the evidence had been given by the various witnesses at the inquest, including that of the two doctors who had performed the post-mortem examination, a verdict was returned which charged Charles Pillar with wilful murder, and stated that the Indian had committed justifiable homicide. The doctors had differed, as it is proverbially said that they will. Dr. Heston, the young medical man who had been called in first, telling the jury that he was not satisfied that the blows given had caused the death, and drawing attention to the peculiar odour he had noticed. But the coroner, an old medical man, sided with the colleague, who pooh-poohed the idea, and the verdict was given. The coroner was a good deal exercised in his mind whether some proceedings ought not to have been taken in respect to the remains of the late colonel, but he obtained no legal support, and the terrible murder and attempted robbery at No. 9A, Albemarle Square, with the history of the embalming and the mysterious inner chamber, were public property for the usual 9 days, when something fresh occurred and the interest died away. Then once more there was the old peace in the dark house, where the remains of Colonel Capel lay in state in the mystery-haunted room. The servants were very reticent, and consequently but little was heard of the proceedings in Albemarle Square. A good many loiterers had stopped to stare at the darkened windows of the great mansion, but as 2 coffins had been borne from the place, it was forgotten outside that another still remained. What might have been some busybody's business became no one's, and the horrible tragedy tended towards the simplification of the dead man's instructions. "It is 9 days now since the Colonel's commands should have been fulfilled," said Mr Girtle, as they were seated at lunch in the darkened dining room, the same party, for Katrine had expressed her determination to stay in the house through all the trouble, and Lydia had offered to remain with her. Katrine and Lydia had kept a great deal to their rooms. Mr Girtle spent most of his time in the library, busy over papers, only appearing at meal times, and consequently Paul Capel was thrown a great deal into the society of Gerard Artis, treating him always in the most friendly way, and declining to notice the barbs of the verbal arrows the other was fond of launching. One of Artis's favourite allusions was to the house his companion inherited. "I felt horribly jealous of you at first," he said. "Seemed such a pot of money, but with special commands to live here with a haunted room and a mausoleum beyond it, no thank you." "What shall you do with the Chamber of Horrors?" said Artis on another occasion. "You heard, it is to be built up." No, I mean the bedroom, eh?" "I shall take that as my own." "What? A room haunted with the spirits of 3 dead men? Bah! Impossible." Then came the 9th day, and Mr Girtle announced that on the next his instructions should be carried out precisely at 12. "That will give you ample time, Mr Capel," to visit a banker afterwards, for, after the late experience, I should not lose an hour in depositing your great uncle's bequest in the hands of your banker. You will go with me, I hope?" The old man looked pleased, and nodded. "But I had reckoned upon seeing the jewels," said Katrine, with a smile at the young heir, which made his heart throb and Lydia shrink. "That pleasure must be deferred, Miss Ingham," said the old lawyer crustily, and no more was said. At 12 o'clock punctually the next day, Mr Girtle unlocked the door of the Colonel's room, and, fulfilling Ramo's duty, held it back while the young men bore in lights. Katrine and Lydia followed, and the old butler, looking shrunken and depressed, came last, to close the door and draw the curtain. It was midday, but it might have been midnight. Candles were lit again on chimney piece and dressing table, and after the old solicitor had seen that the door was fastened within, he took out his key, drew the portal curtain at the end, and then unlocked and slowly pushed open the iron door. At a given order the butler solemnly carried a couple of candles down into the vault, and stood there in the gloomy stone chamber, where, to those who stood waiting his return, they seemed to cast a peculiarly weird light. Then, in utter silence, the lid was placed over the calm, sleeping features, and the four men, taking each a handle, lifted and bore the coffin down. There was some little difficulty in the sharp turn of the steps, but in a few minutes all was done, and the coffin lay upon the flagstones, while the two girls stood hand clasping hand. Mr Girtle walked round to the back of the iron safe, and stooped down, when a peculiar clang was heard, as if a spring had been set free, and a large panel at the end, where Capel was standing, dropped down. As the old lawyer came back, candle in hand, it was now seen that the panel that had fallen laid bare a keyhole. Upon the key being inserted in this, and turned, the panel flew back, and glided over the keyhole as soon as the key was drawn out, displaying a second keyhole, crossed by a row of lettered brass slides. These the old lawyer manipulated till the letters formed in a row a particular word. When the second keyhole was laid bare, the key inserted and turned, and one end of the iron safe revolved on a pair of huge pivots, showing the interior plain, rectangular and dark, with an oblong mass of black metal in the centre. "The steel chest," said the old lawyer in a whisper, as he stepped inside the great safe, in which he could nearly stand upright. Candle in hand he went to the other end, put down the light for a moment to set his hands free to get a second key, a curiously long, thin key, with the end of which he pushed something at the back of the chest. Then, going to one side, he repeated the act, went back round to the other side, and again repeated it, after which he came to the front, and as he held down the light, those who were intently watching his actions saw that there was a small circle of Roman figures, with a hand like that of a small clock, which he pushed round with the end of the key till it was at the letter V. This done, he bent over the chest, and repeated the action twice upon the top. Then, as he stepped out, a sharp sound was heard, and a keyhole was laid bare once more. In this he placed the key, turned it, and the steel chest seemed to split open from end to end, dividing in equal parts, which slowly turned over on massive hinges, leaving the centre a space large enough to hold the coffin wide open. "Mr Capel," said the old lawyer, stepping aside. "The next duty is yours. There lie the bank notes and the case of precious stones. I give them over to your care." Paul Capel hesitated for a moment, glanced at his companions, then back at the opening leading to the Colonel's room, where Katrine and Lydia were watching. The young man's heart beat heavily as he took the candle, and, stooping down, entered the iron chamber to take from its hiding place his enormous fortune. It was but a step, and he had only stretched out his hand to pick up the two cases, but the steel chest held nothing. The treasure was not there. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Dark House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark House by George Manville Fenn. Chapter 12. The End of the Instructions. Paul Capel did not realise his position. "Is there some mistake, Mr Girtle?" "Mistake? There is nothing here." "Nothing there?" "Nothing. See for yourself." The old man stepped in, searched, and came out with drops of sweat upon his yellow forehead. "Well?" exclaimed Capel, excitedly, as the old man stared in a dazed way. "It is gone," said the old lawyer in a hoarse voice, and his hands trembling violently. "Well, Mr Girtle," said Capel at last, in a voice that he vainly strove to make firm, "what have you to say?" "To say?" said the old lawyer hastily. "Oh, it is all a cock and bull story," cried Artis. "There never was any treasure." "Silence, sir!" cried the old lawyer, recovering himself. "How can you speak like that in the presence of the dead?" "Bah!" cried Artis. "Presence of the dead, indeed! Presence of a mummy! Would you have me pull a long face as I went through the British Museum? I would have you behave." "You look here," cried Artis sharply. "You are executor, and this treasure, if there was one, lay in your charge. It's nothing to me. If it were, I should call in the police." "Mr Capel," cried the old lawyer excitedly, "I swear to you, sir, that the money and jewels were there a fortnight ago. I came down here with Ramo, and there lay the two cases with their contents." "Well?" said Capel. "And what then?" "We carefully closed up the place." "Then somebody must have been down since, and taken the treasure away." "Only two men could have done this, sir, Ramo and myself." "That throws it on to you," said Artis. "And my reputation, sir, will bear me out when I proclaim my innocence." "I don't know," said Artis. "Sudden temptation, kleptomania, and that sort of thing." The old lawyer turned his back. "Mr Gerard Artis, this is no time for such remarks as these," said Capel. "Mr Girtle, what have you to say?" "At present, nothing, sir. I am astounded. You know we came down on that dreadful morning, and found the chamber intact. Besides, it could not have been forced." "There were the keys," said Artis. "But they have never left my person. There were but the two sets of keys, the Colonel's and mine. Those were the Colonel's set that we found upon Ramo." "Rather strange that the Colonel should have given you a set," said Artis. "No more strange than that a gentleman should trust a banker," said Capel. "What, going to side with the lawyer?" Capel made no reply, only gazed searchingly at the old executor. "There may have been other keys, Mr Girtle." "Oh, no. The place was made some years ago. for a sarcophagus, and the makers never imagined that it would be used for a safe." There was a dead silence. "Let us search again. The cases may have slipped aside." "It is impossible," said the old lawyer, and as they two passed into the iron chamber, Artis exchanged a glance with Katrine, while the old butler stood looking dazed. "You see," said Mr Girtle, holding down the light, "there is nowhere for the cases to have slipped. All is of plain, solid steel, without a corner or a crack." "But underneath," said Capel. "Underneath? Look for yourself," said Mr Girtle. "Where there is not solid steel there is solid iron, and beneath that massive stone. The treasure seems to have been spirited away." "That's it," said Artis. "The old man was not satisfied, and he got up out of his coffin and hid it somewhere else." Capel caught Artis by the collar. "I will not," he began, but mastering his indignant anger, he let fall his arm. "There is nothing here," he said. "Let us look about the outside." That was the work of a minute, for on every hand there was the blank stone wall, floor, and roof, and the exterior of the iron safe or tomb was perfectly rectangular and smooth. "What was the size of the cases?" "One was about 12 inches by 8, and 3 or 4 deep, and the other rather smaller," replied the old lawyer. "Both too large for me to have juggled them into my pockets when I opened the steel chest, Mr Artis. You held the keys, and if you meant to take the treasure, you had it before." "Enough of this," cried Capel. "It is plain that the bequest has been taken away. Mr Girtle, we will finish at once. Fulfil my uncle's commands. Come." He went to the head of the oaken coffin, and took one handle, when, influenced by his example, the others helped to raise it a little from the floor, and it was thrust in and onward, till it rested upon the bottom of the steel chest, nearly filling the space. Capel stood on the right of the entrance, and for fully 5 minutes there was perfect silence in the solemn chamber. "Go on, Mr Girtle," Capel said at last, and the old man bent down, thrust the key in the end, gave a half turn, and the two ponderous sides slowly curved over till they were nearly together, leaving only a few inches of the shining brass breastplate visible. Then there was a faint click, and the left side fell heavily, setting free the right, which descended with a loud clang, and closed tightly over a rebate in the lower side, so closely that it was only by holding a candle near that the junction could be seen. "Go on," and the old lawyer again inserted a key. There was no show of effort on his part, as the old lawyer turned the key, when the end of the iron chamber closed in tightly, and after once more examining the blank stone chamber, they slowly ascended the steps. Then the iron door was closed and locked, and Mr Girtle handed Capel the keys. An hour later a couple of masons were at work with the stones that were below in the locked-up cellar, and the next day they had filled in a wall of 6 feet thick, cemented over the face, so that only a dark patch showed where the entrance to the Colonel's tomb had been. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Dark House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark House by George Manville Fenn. Chapter 13. The Young Doctor. "Look here," said Artis, "you mustn't be offended with me. I speak very plainly, and if I can be of any use to you I will." They were in the drawing room, Preenham having announced that the Masons had left. "I am not going to think of your remarks." "I was thinking of going to day," continued Artis, "but I feel now that I ought not to go and leave you in a regular hole like this. There is no need for you to stay." "Well, no need, of course. But I suppose you will not kick me out." "Of course not. You are welcome." "That's right," said Artis. "You see," he continued, looking round to where Katrine and Lydia sat together, "I feel it due to myself to stop and show that I had no hand in that." "No one accused you, Mr Artis?" "Oh, no, of course not. That would be too good a joke." "Then I shall stay." "Our case is different," said Lydia, turning red and then pale. "Mr Capel, Miss D'Enghien and I, if we can be of no more use, would like to say good bye this afternoon." "But why?" cried Capel, as he glanced at the speaker, and then fixed his eyes on Katrine. "There is no occasion for you to leave." "I think Miss Lawrence is right," said Katrine. "But I want help and counsel from both of you. You must not leave me yet." "It is impossible for us to stay." "Impossible! Why? Etiquette? Is not Mr Girtle here? Are not things as they have been since we met?" "I did not know that Mr Girtle was going to stop," said Katrine, softly. "If I felt that we could be of any service " "Then you will stay?" cried Capel warmly. Katrine hesitated, looked up, then down, raised her eyes once more, and left her chair to take Lydia's hand. "Let us go upstairs," she said softly. Lydia rose at once. "You do not speak," said Capel. Katrine did not answer till they reached the door, and then she raised her eyes to his with a long, timid look. "If Lydia consents, so will I." "And you will stay, Miss Lawrence, to help me?" cried Capel warmly. "I will," said Lydia gravely. "That's right," cried Capel, opening the door for them to pass out, and catching Katrine's eye for a moment as she passed. "Curse her! She's playing a dangerous game," said Artis to himself, as he watched the ladies leave the room. Glancing aside, he saw that the old lawyer was watching him narrowly. "I suppose you are not glad that I am going to stay, Mr Girtle," he said. "For some things I am," said the old man coolly. "For others I am not." Just then Capel returned. The two girls separated as they reached their rooms, Katrine kissing Lydia's cheek, and then, as soon as she was alone, her countenance changed, and she sat gazing with glowing eyes that seemed full of some purpose upon which she was bent. At the same time Lydia Lawrence sat with her face buried in her hands, weeping silently and wishing that she were back in her country home. Very little more was said below, for Mr Girtle had an engagement in the city and left the young men together. "You won't have a detective set to work?" "No." "Well, do as you like. I'm off for a run, to get rid of this gloom. Back to dinner." "Thank goodness!" said Artis, breathing more freely, and 5 minutes after he was slowly crossing the square, wondering who the man was who had just gone up to the door he had left. "I've seen his face before," he muttered. "Why, of course, the young doctor. What does he want?" Capel was thinking of the fortune that had slipped through his fingers, depressed and yet at times overjoyed, for Katrine's glance had been full of hope. But he must trace the money that had been taken, and the gems. How lovely they would look on Katrine's neck! He sighed as he pictured her thus adorned, and he was sinking into a daydream when the door opened softly, and Preenham entered with the doctor's card. "Dr Heston, show him up." Capel motioned his visitor to a chair, when the keen-looking young doctor, who was watching him narrowly, said: "I dare say you are surprised to see me here." "Oh, no. A call?" "I only make professional calls, Mr Capel. I have come to you on an important matter." "Indeed!" exclaimed Capel. "Yes, respecting the death of one of those two men, the Indians, sir. I'm afraid there was some foul play there." "Foul play? Why, he was killed with a life preserver." The doctor tapped with his fingers on his hat, as if he was beating a funeral march. Then quickly: "No, sir. The more I study this case, the more I feel convinced that he was not." End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Dark House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark House by George Manville Fenn. Chapter 14. A Clever Diplomatist. "Dr Heston, you surprise me. There was the inquest." "Yes, where my opinion, sir, was overruled by the coroner and my colleague, both elderly medical men, sir, while I am a young and comparatively inexperienced." "You are disposed to think that this is a case of professional jealousy." "I will be frank with you. I did think so." "Exactly. But pray disabuse your mind. I am not jealous. I am angry with myself for giving way in that case. It seemed all very straightforward, but it was not." "May I ask what you mean?" "I mean, sir, that I am certain that our poor old Indian friend did not die from the blow that he received from that life preserver." "How then?" said Capel huskily. "It seems to me that he must have been poisoned in some way or another, and I could not rest without coming to you." "Oh, impossible!" "Perhaps so, sir, but I am telling you what I believe. Do you think he had any enemies here?" "Oh, no. The servants seem to have been on friendly terms." "Well, it hardly seems like it." "That wretch must have yielded to a terrible temptation," said Capel, "and the other was defending his master's goods." "What goods?" said the doctor. Capel was silent. "I see, sir. There is more mystery about this than you care to explain. Was there some heavy sum of money in the late Colonel's room, and were these two men in league?" "I don't think they were in league." "Was any one else interested in the matter?" "Oh, no, impossible," said Capel half aloud. "Dr Heston, I am afraid there is a good deal of imagination in what you say. Let me try and disabuse your mind." "I should be glad if you could." Capel paced the room for a few minutes. "This has taken me quite by surprise, Dr Heston," he said. "Give me a little time to think it over. Will you keep perfectly private all that you have said to me?" "I don't like to suspect men unjustly, and yet I'm afraid I've done wrong in giving him time," said the doctor as he went down. "Well, a week is not an age." As soon as he had left, Paul Capel let his head go down upon his hands, for his brain seemed to be in a whirl. The death of Ramo, the disappearance of the fortune, the visit of the doctor. It only wanted this latter, with the hints he had thrown out, to fire a train of latent suspicion in the young man's mind. There was that open window that the policeman had declared had not been used. Was he wrong? Had others been in the conspiracy and turned afterwards on Ramo and Charles? They might have been in the plot. Or, again, they might have been defending their master's wealth against the wretch who had escaped with the treasure by the open window. Those three Italians. Had they anything to do with the matter? The old butler. He seemed so quiet and innocent, but often beneath an air of innocency crime found a resting place. Then he found himself suspecting Mr Girtle, and on the face of the evidence Capel laid before himself, the case looked very black. He knew everything. He held the keys. He, the old friend and companion, had been left merely a signet ring. "Impossible!" cried Capel half aloud. "I might as well suspect Artis, or Miss Lawrence, or Katrine herself." "May I come in?" said a voice that sent a thrill through the thinker, and Katrine D'Enghien stood in the doorway. "Come in? Yes," cried Capel, advancing to meet her with open hands, and moved by an impulse that he could not withstand. "Is anything the matter?" she said simply. "Yes, no, yes, a great deal is the matter," cried Capel. "There, I must speak to you." "Mr Capel," she said, half in alarm. "Forgive me if I seem impetuous," he cried, "but I am greatly troubled in mind, and I feel as if I would give anything for the sympathy of one who would listen to my troubles, and help me with her counsel." "Surely you have all our sympathy, Mr Capel," said Katrine, innocently. "Yes, I hope so," he cried earnestly, "but I want more than that, Katrine. You must know that I love you." "Mr Capel!" "Pray do not be angry with me." "Is this a time or season to make such a declaration to me, Mr Capel?" said Katrine softly. "For some things, no; for other things, yes. I am in such sore need of help and counsel, such as could be given me by the woman who returned my love." "No, no, don't leave me. Hear me out. As soon as I heard that will read, it filled my heart with joy, for it told me that I was rich, and that these were riches which I could share with you. Then, when the discovery was made that the treasure had been stolen, it was not the wealth that I regretted, but I despaired because it seemed that you were farther from me. But listen to me. I am trying hard to discover how this large fortune has been swept away." Katrine's eyes glittered. "Help me in my endeavours, and tell me this some day if I make the discovery, and am I once more in a position to ask you to be my wife, you will listen to me?" She raised her beautiful eyes to his, and he caught her hand. It was withdrawn, and she said softly, "I am sorry you should think me so sordid." "Then you love me?" he cried. "I made no such confession. The man to whom I give my hand will not be chosen for the sake of his money." "Then I may hope?" he cried. "Mr Capel, is it not your duty to find your fortune?" "Yes, but let me say our fortune," he cried. "Mr Capel, do not speak to me again like this. I should feel that I was standing in your light if I listened now." "But at some future time?" She looked at him softly, and his breath went and came fast, as her speaking eyes rested on his, and he saw the damask red deepen in her cheeks. "Wait till that future time comes," she whispered. "And you will help me?" he cried. "Yes," she said at last, "I will help you all I can." He would have caught her in his arms, but she raised her hand. "I thought we were to be friends." "Friends?" he whispered. "I love you." "It must be then as a friend," she said in her low voice, but there was that in her look which made Capel's heart throb, while, when she extended her hand, he kissed it, without being aware that Lydia had entered the room and drawn back, with a weary look of misery in her face that she vainly sought to hide. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Dark House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark House by George Manville Fenn. Chapter 15. In the Dark. Look here, Kate. I'm not going back till I've had a good try here to see if something can't be made out of this affair. Katrine D'Enghien sat in the drawing room of the Dark House, with her eyes half closed, as if listening to the ballad Lydia was singing in a low tone in the corner of the back room, while Capel stood by turning over the leaves. The old lawyer was in another corner at a card table, on whose green surface lay a heap of papers and parchments, one of which he took up from time to time, and laid down, after examining it by the light of the shaded lamp. "You said only yesterday that you were sick of domestic cemetery," said Katrine. "So I am, for it's doleful enough for anything here, only it makes me mad to see such wealth of art treasures and plate belongings to this fellow Capel." "Then it is very evident that you did not filch the old man's treasure," said Katrine. "Yes, my dear, very evident. If I had, I should not be here." "Unless you thought it better for the sake of throwing people off the scent," said Katrine, with a peculiar look in his face. "I say," he cried, returning the gaze, "what do you mean? You don't think I killed those two fellows and got the plunder, do you?" "I don't know," she replied. "Well, then, I didn't. I never had the chance." "Or the brains to conceive such a coup." "Look here," cried Artis. "Don't speak so loud, Gerard." "Oh, very well. But look here, Madam Clever, did you manage that bit of business?" Katrine raised her soft white hands. "Don't do that," said the young man. "You make me want to kiss them." "You would not be so foolish now." "I don't know. And look here, I don't like you being so thick with Capel." "Don't you? He wants to marry me." "I'll break his neck first." "You will act sensibly and well, monsieur," said Katrine. "That is, if you mean that we are to be married by and by." "Mean it, of course." "But not on a fortune of £100 each, monsieur." "Good heavens, no." "Then hold your tongue and say nothing." "But I shall say something, if I see you working up a flirtation with that cad." "You will say nothing, do nothing, see nothing. We cannot marry and starve." "But tell me, Kate, honour bright, you don't care for this Capel?" "I care for him." "Tell me, then, what do you mean to do?" "Have my share of that money," said Katrine, with a peculiar hardening of her face. "Bah! I don't believe the treasure ever existed. It was a craze on the old man's part." "You must be careful. Don't say or do anything to annoy Paul Capel or Mr Girtle. We must stay here. It was no craze on the old man's part. Maybe I can tell where the fortune is." "What? You mean that?" "Hush! I am working for us both." "But tell me." "Hush! She has finished the song," said Katrine, leaning back and clapping her hands softly. Thank you," she said. "Oh, what a while it is since I heard that dear old ballad." The evening wore away till bedtime, when the butler brought in and lit the candles, according to his custom, Katrine and Lydia taking theirs, and going at once, and Gerard Artis following after partaking of a glass of soda water, leaving the old lawyer and Capel together. They sat in silence for some minutes, when the old lawyer said: "I do not seem to get any nearer to the unravelling of this knot, Mr Capel. Do you still adhere to the opinion that the treasure was there?" "Yes, and we shall find it soon." "By a masterly inactivity?" "Oh, no," replied the old man, "for I am taking steps of my own to redeem myself. I don't think those jewels can be sold, or one of those notes changed, without word being brought to me." Capel felt won by the old man's manner. He shook hands with him warmly, and said good night. He went to the door with him, and saw the light shine on the thin, silvery hair as he went slowly up the staircase, while his candle cast a grotesque shadow on the wall. Then, as Capel listened, he heard the old man shut his chamber door, open it softly, and shut it again more loudly, while the great house, seeming to be doubly steeped in darkness and silence, Paul Capel went back to the lounge in which he had been seated, leaving his chamber candle burning like a tiny star in the great sea of gloom, and sat back thinking. The candle burned lower as he thought on, ransacking his memory for some slight clue that would help him to find his lost fortune. The candle went out. Had he been asleep? He could not say. He believed that he had been only thinking deeply. At all events, he was widely awake now, as he sat back, listening to the heavy beating of his own heart, as he stared through the intense darkness towards the door, upon whose panel he had felt sure he had heard a soft pat, as if something had touched it. A minute! It might have been half an hour. It seemed so long. And there was a faint rustling, and Paul Capel knew, as he stared through that intense darkness, that someone or something was coming silently towards where he sat. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Dark House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark House by George Manville Fenn. Chapter 16. You here? Paul Capel was not superstitious, but a curious thrill ran through his nerves, and his first impulse was to leap up and shout, "Who's there?" Then a thought flashed through his brain that whoever this was might have something to do with the disappearance of the treasure, and he told himself that he would wait, though the next moment he found himself frankly owning that a chill of dread had frozen his powers, and that he could not have moved to save his life. A minute's reflection told him that it could not be a burglar. No one would come singly upon such a mission, and the marauder would have been provided with a dark lantern or matches. It must be someone in the house. The superstitious fancies were cleared away, as his heart gave a throb, with the hope that he might now find the clue to the mystery that was hanging over the place. Thought after thought flashed through his brain, and, as they dazed him with the wild conjectures, the person, whoever it was, glided nearer and nearer, and all doubt fled, for whoever it was had stretched out a hand and touched the silver candlestick upon the table where he had set it down. There was again silence, and then it seemed to Capel, as he sat there, that the nocturnal visitor had made the table a starting point for a fresh departure in the dark, and was going from him toward the back drawing-room, in the left-hand corner of which the old lawyer had sat that night. Doubtless there are people who can weigh every act before they commit themselves to it, but the majority of us, even the most thoughtful, go on weighing a great many, and then in the most important moments of our lives forget all about the balance or the mental weights and scales. And so it was that, all in an instant, Paul Capel, unable longer to bear the mental strain, rose quickly from his seat, took 2 strides forward, and grasped at the intruder, exclaiming, "Who's there?" He touched nothing, he heard nothing, and the old chill came back for a moment or two with its superstitious suggestions, but he drew out a little silver matchbox, which rattled as he opened it, shook a match into his moist hand, struck it, and the faint little star of light flashed out. "Katrine, you here!" he exclaimed. There were candles on an occasional table, and he lit one before the little wax match burned down, and then he remained speechless for the moment, gazing at Katrine D'Enghien, who stood within the back drawing-room, her long hair loosely knotted on her neck, her white arms outstretched before her, and half-way from him. She stood motionless, as if turned to stone. "Katrine!" he cried again. He took a step or two towards her, his first impulse being to clasp her in his arms, but, as she stood motionless before him, draped in a long grey peignoir that swept the ground, there was something about her that repelled him, so that he stood staring at her, unable to speak. Suddenly she turned from him, and stood gazing at the corner where the piano stood, walking slowly towards it, and rested her hand upon it, remaining there motionless for a few moments till, catching up the candle, Capel went towards her, his pulses throbbing, and his temples seeming to flush, as if a hot breath from a furnace had passed over them. But before he reached her she turned slowly, and walked straight towards him, her eyes wide open and gazing intently before her. She would have walked right upon him had he not given way, and then stood holding the candle, while she went deliberately to the fireplace, rested her hands upon the mantelpiece, and stood there holding one bare white foot towards the extinct fire as if to warm it. Capel set down the candle, and advanced towards her, when once more she turned and came straight towards him, and this time he took her in his arms and kissed her quickly and passionately upon her cheek and lips. His arms dropped to his sides, though, for he felt that she was icily cold, and as involuntarily he gave place, as she walked slowly past him to the open door, out onto the broad landing, and as he caught up the candle and followed, he saw the tall grey figure go slowly on up and up the stairs, and when he followed it to the first landing, it was on the one above, going slowly on to the bedroom at the end, through whose door it passed, and the lock gave a low, soft click. Paul Capel went back into the drawing-room, feeling half stunned, and when he reached the middle of the room he paused, candle in hand, thinking. "Asleep!" he said at last. "Asleep! And I dared to take her in my arms like that!" Then, with an involuntary shiver, the young man turned quickly round, and went hastily up to his room, to lie till morning, tossing sleeplessly from side to side. End of Chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Dark House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark House by George Manville Fenn. Chapter 17. The 10th Night. It might be, thought Capel, as he dwelt upon the adventure of that night. Katrine had descended to breakfast the next morning, and he fancied she blushed slightly as he pressed her hand, but she looked so frankly in his face that he could not but think that she was ignorant of what had taken place. The days slipped by, and, in company, by a private understanding, Capel and the old lawyer searched every article of furniture that could possibly have been made the receptacle of the lost treasure. "I'll help you, of course, my dear sir," said the old man, "if you wish it, but I really think we shall do no good." There had been several talks about breaking up the party, but Capel, as host, had always begged that his companions would stay, urging Mr Girtle to back him up by proposing that there should be no change until the whole of the business of the will was completed so far as the others were concerned. "I shall find my share at last," Capel said laughingly, "and besides, I have the house." One afternoon, when Artis had accompanied the ladies for a drive, and the search was about to be recommenced, Mr Girtle sat down by his little table in the drawing room and said: "I have a little news for you, Mr Capel." "What, have you found the clue?" "Not yet," said the old man quietly, "but I have found an angel." "A what?" "An angel. You did not know we had one in this house." "Indeed, but I did," cried Capel. "Ah, yes," said the old man, looking at him thoughtfully, "but I'm afraid we are not thinking of the same." "Indeed, but we are," said Capel warmly. "No one who has seen Miss D'Enghien could hesitate to say that she is a very handsome woman," said the old lawyer, "but I was referring to Miss Lawrence." "A lady for whom I entertain the most profound esteem," said Capel. "Which will be strengthened, sir, when I tell you that she came to me and made a proposition that—" The old lawyer's communication was checked by the announcement of a visitor for Mr Capel, and the doctor, Mr Heston, was ushered in. His visit was not productive of much, for he had only to announce that he was more and more sure in his own mind that he was right, the result being that Capel asked him to wait before taking any further steps, and Dr Heston went away rather dissatisfied in his own mind. "If he does not follow up my proposals," he said to himself, "I shall begin to think that he has some reason of his own for keeping the matter quiet." The ladies returned directly the doctor had gone, and Artis, in pursuance of his instructions, made himself so agreeable to Capel that he did not leave him alone with the old lawyer, while at dinner and during the evening no opportunity was likely to occur for a private conversation. "I'll see you directly after breakfast to-morrow morning, Mr Capel," the old man said. "I should prefer a quiet business chat with you, for the matter is important." "I should like to have heard it at once," replied Capel, "but as you will." Suspicion was very busy in the dark house in those days, for the butler had found that for several nights past chamber candles had been burned down in the sockets in one of the candlesticks, which candlestick was left in the drawing room, while a tall candlestick was afterwards taken up to the bedroom. Preenham wanted to know why Mr Capel, or the young master, as he termed him, should want to sit up so late, so he watched, and saw that, night after night, He stayed down in the drawing room for hours. But he found out nothing, only that the cold struck even through the mat from the stone floor, and that he was chilly enough when he went to bed in his pantry to require a liqueur of brandy to keep off rheumatism and similar attacks. For Mr Capel had remained up after the others had gone, night after night, blaming himself for behaving in an unfair, unmanly spirit, but unable to control the impulse which led him to long for such another adventure as on that special night. But after a long day, night watches grow wearisome to the most ardent lovers, and when, after 9 nights spent in expectancy, there was no result, no soft, gliding step heard upon stair or floor, both Capel and Preenham grew weary, and retired to their couches like the rest. It was on the 10th night that Capel, instead of going to bed at once, sat musing over the old lawyer's words. Then he began thinking of the doctor's visit, and at last, taking out his watch, he saw it was close upon 2. The hour made him think of the night when he had encountered Katrine just at that time, and moved by some impulse, he knew not what, he went to his door, softly opened it, and gazed out on to the gloomy staircase, where all was silent as the grave. No, there was the faint creak of a hinge that had been opened, and with his heart seeming to stand still, Capel stood in the darkness listening, till, utterly wearied, he was about to close his door, when, so softly that he could hardly distinguish the sweep of the dress, something passed him, going straight to the stairs, and then he could just hear, whoever it was, descend. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Dark House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark House by George Manville Fenn. Chapter 18. Nocturnal Proceedings. There was not a sound to be heard as Paul Capel stole softly down in his dressing gown, and, as he expected, the drawing-room door was closed, but not latched. Pushing it softly, feeling certain that Katrine, if it was she, had entered there, he followed, and went on, till he was about in the middle of the room, and listening attentively. He began to think that he must have been mistaken, when there was a faint rustle, and a heavy breath was drawn, the sounds coming from the lesser drawing-room. He listened more intently, his heart beating heavily, and a strange singing in his ears. Another sound as of something being touched. The pen tray on the little card table where Mr Girtle sat and worked. And what was that? Undoubtedly one of the keys that lay there. Another and another was touched, and as they were moved on the thin mahogany, the bottom of the receptacle for cards, the sound seemed quite loud. Then came a faint scraping sound, and he knew as well as if he had seen it, that a key was taken up. Keys? Yes, there were several there which the old lawyer used. Capel recalled that the key of the plate closest had been placed there when Preenham had handed it over. He listened, but there was no further sound. Yes, the low breathing could be heard, and it suddenly dawned upon Capel that Katrine had been approaching him. There she was, close at hand. He had only to stretch forth his arms, and the next instant she would have been folded to his breast. It was a hard fight, but he had read of a sudden awakening under such conditions proving dangerous. As he listened, there was a faint rustling as the soft grey peignoir he knew so well passed over the thick carpet towards the door, and if the listener had any doubt, it was set aside by the light pat that he heard. It was a hand touching the panel. Capel waited a minute, during which he heard the dress sweep against the edge of the door, and then the sound was quite hushed. He knew what that meant too. The door had been drawn to, and so he found it as he stepped lightly there, opened it, and passed out on to the great landing, where he strained his eyes upward to try and make out the graceful draped figure as it went up the winding staircase to the bedroom. It was not so dark there, for a faint gloom, it could not be called light, fell from the great ground glass skylight at the top of the winding staircase, like so much diluted darkness being poured down into a well. The great winding staircase suddenly seemed to him full of horror as he stood there. It had never struck him before, but now, how terrible it seemed. That balustrade was so low. Suppose, poor girl, in her sleep, she should lean over it, and fall down on to the white stones, where the black fretwork of the glistening stove could be seen like a square patch against the white slabs. There was no reason for such fancies, but Paul Capel's hands grew wet with a cold perspiration. "I ought to have stopped her, and awakened her at any risk," he said as he still gazed up the great staircase. And then his heart seemed to stand still, for there was a faint click as of a lock shot back, and it came either from on a level with where he stood or from down below. In an instant he realized what had happened. Katrine had been to fetch the key of the late Colonel's chamber, and had gone in there. He hesitated a moment, and then, going close, he softly touched the door and felt it yield. Just then there came a faint scratching noise, and there was a gleam of light, showing him that the heavy curtain was drawn. Then the light shone more clearly, and pressing the door a little more open, he glided through. He was about to peer out softly when the light was set down. He heard the soft rustle of the dress. An arm was thrust round from the far side of the curtain, and the door was carefully closed. "The work of a spy," he said, but a slight sound attracted his attention, and his curiosity mastered all other feelings. Gently sliding his hand into his pocket, he drew out a penknife, and cut gently downwards, making a slit a few inches in length. This he drew slightly apart and gazed through, to see that Katrine was standing with her back to him, in the act of opening one of the large cabinets at the side of the bed. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Dark House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark House by George Manville Fenn. Chapter 19. Birds of Prey. Travellers in Mayfair will have noticed that every here and there old-fashioned, snug-looking hostelries exist in out-of-the-way places, at the corner of a mews, in a private street, where they do not seem to belong, and they are generally kept by ex-butlers, who have taken wives, joining their savings, and gone into business with the brewer's help. In the parlour of the Four in Hand, Lower Maybush Street, a party of gentlemen's servants were playing bagatelle upon a bad board in a very smoky atmosphere, while a knot of three men sat at one of the old, narrow, battered mahogany tables in a corner, drinking cold gin and water, and smoking bad cigars. One was a little sharp-eyed, round-headed man, smartly dressed, and evidently rather proud of a large gilt pin in his figured silk tie. Another was a tall and not ill-looking. He might have been a valet, for there was a certain imitation gentility about his cut. A valet whose master had been rather addicted to the turf, and this had been reflected on this man to extent of trousers rather too tight, short hair, and a horseshoe pin with pearl nails. The third was rather a shabby-looking man of 40, undoubtedly a gentleman's servant out of place, carrying the sign in the front of the reason why, in the shape of a nose unduly ripened by being bathed in glasses of alcoholic drink. "Knew him long, did you say?" said the tall man, tapping his chin with an ivory-handled rattan cane. 10 years, poor chap," said the ex-servant. "It was very horrid." "Here, never mind that," said the brisk little man. "We don't want horrors. Touch the bell, Dick. Come, old fellow, sip up your lotion, and we'll have them filled again. That cigar don't draw. Try one of these. Here, 3/4 of gin cold," he cried to the landlord, and as soon as the glasses were refilled, and cigars lighted, the conversation went on, to the accompaniment of rattling balls and laughter from the bagatelle players. "Well," said the tall man in a low voice, "you can do as you like, my lad, but I should have thought that, hard up as you are, and I should say without much chance of getting another crib, say at present, you'd have been glad to earn an honest quid or two." The shabby-looking man shook his head. "Here, you're always putting on the pace too much, Dick," said the little man. "A fellow wants a little time. He's on, you see if he isn't. My respects to you, Mr. Barnes. Ha! Nice flavoured drop of gin that." "You see, you know the house well," continued the tall man. "Often been, of course?" "Oh, yes. Had many a glass of wine there, when poor Charles was alive." "Rather a bit of mystery that," said the little man. "I put that and that together, and I set it down that he was trying the job on his own account, and muffled it." The shabby man shuddered, and took a hearty draught of his gin and water. "There would be only us three in the game," said the tall man softly, "and it would be share and share alike. Why, if we worked it right, it would set you up. Might take a pub on it." "Eh?" said the shabby man. "I say you might take a pub and drink yourself to death," was added aside. The little man winked at his tall companion, unobserved by the other, who looked dreamy. "Bars at all the lower windows, eh?" "Yes, yes. You couldn't get in there," was the quick reply. "More ways of killing a cat than by hanging it. Look here, my lads. There's a stable to let in the mews at the back." The shabby man looked up quickly. "I had a look at it to-day. Any one could easily get to that window looking on the leads." "But that's the window where—" "Well, dead men tell no tales, and they don't get in the way. That's the place." "Oh, no," said the shabby man. "Bah! You're not afraid. I tell you it would be as easy as easy. You can give me a plan of the place, and all about it, and why it's child's play, my lad, and won't hurt anybody. Take everything out of that stable, and have a cart in the coach house. I say, touch that bell again, old man. You are not going to let a fortune slip through your fingers, I know." The three occupants of the corner soon after rose to go, halting halfway down the street, where the tall man said, "There's half a sovereign to keep the cold out till then. 12 o'clock, mind, punctual." The shabby man slouched away, while the little fellow rubbed his hands. "There's half a ton of it there," he whispered. "Think he'll stand to it?" "No fear. Now we've got him over his fright. By jingo, I'm only afraid of one thing." "What's that?" "That someone else will be on the job." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Dark House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark House by George Manville Fenn. Chapter 20. Asleep or Awake. It was a painful and, Paul Capel thought, a degrading position, but he blamed his passion, telling himself that it was his duty to watch her, in this sleep-walking state, lest ill should befall. How thoroughly awake she seemed to be! Her every act was that of a person perfectly herself, and eager to find something that was hidden. Softly and quickly she examined the cabinet, opening drawer after drawer, and taking out one after the other, to see whether there was a concealed cavity behind. Next she knelt down before a large carved oak chest, and Capel saw how carefully she searched that, and examined top and bottom to see whether either was false. This done, she walked to the bed, and stood pondering there. Crossing to the built-up portal, she drew the curtain aside, revealing the half-dry cement. She shook her head, and walked to the window, where she carefully rearranged the heavy folds there, to keep the rays of light from passing out and betraying her task to anyone who might be at the upper windows of some house. The act displayed the working of a brain that, if slumbering, still held a peculiar activity of an abnormal kind. Once or twice he caught sight of Katrine's eyes, that were not as he had seen them on that other night, wide open, and staring straight before her, but bright, eager, and full of animation. She must be awake, he thought, and the idea was strengthened as he saw her throw herself down upon a chair, and with a peculiar action of her hands indicative of disappointment, rest her elbows on her knee, her chin upon her clenched fists, and there she bent down, her face intent, her brows knit, and looking 10 years older, as the candle cast a curious shadow on her countenance. Then the lover intervened on her behalf. No, she could not be. To suppose that she was awake was to credit her with being deceitful, with cheating him into the belief that night that she was asleep. He was about to spring out, throw himself at her feet and awaken her with his caresses, but a chilling feeling of repulsion stayed him. It might work mischief in the terrible fright it would give her at being awakened in that gloomy room. And besides, what a place to select for his passionate avowals! It was secret and silent, the very home for such a love as his, but there was the terrible past. Where she was seated but a short time back, there lay the ghastly body of the murdered man. Behind her was the bed where so recently a strange occupant was stretched, and beneath it lay that other lately discovered horror. Beyond that built-up wall was Colonel's tomb. Love was impossible in such a place as that, and did he want confirmation of the fact that Katrine was a somnambulist, he felt that he had it here before him. For no girl of her years would dare to come down in the dead of the night and enter that room, haunted, as it was, with such terrible memories. He stood watching her as she crouched there, looking straight before her, and as she suddenly sprang up and went to a picture painted upon a panel in the wall, he found himself growing excited by the fancy that, perhaps, in the clairvoyant state of sleep, she might be able to discover the mystery that had baffled them all. He stood there wrapped in his thoughts, till he saw her turn from the frame that she had tried to move in a dozen different ways, her fingers playing here and there with marvellous quickness about the corners and prominent bits of carving, as if she expected that any one might prove to be a secret spring. Again she tried another picture, darted to the group of statuary in the corner, and tried to lift it back, as if expecting that which she sought might be hidden beneath it. And again there was the movement, full of dejection and despair, as she stood facing him with the light full upon her eyes. She turned away despondently, and then started upright with her eyes flashing, and one hand raised in the involuntary movement of one who listens intently to some sound. Had she heard something, or was it fancy, a part of her dream? Paul Capel thought the latter, for, light as a fawn, he saw Katrine dart across the room to where the candle stood. The next moment they were in total darkness. Chapter 20.